Welcome, everyone, to Sustainable St. John's Speaker Series for the month of June. So my name is Megan, and I'm a board member with Sustainable St. John. I'm here today with Denis Caron, the President and CEO of the Port of Belledune. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that while we meet today on a virtual platform, we are situated in New Brunswick, which is in the unceded traditional territory of the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy peoples. So Denis is here with us to discuss the Port of Belledune's plan to transition to a more sustainable business model, including looking at strategies such as greener shipping options, renewable energy sources, and clean technologies. So as the president and CEO of the Port of Belledune, Denis has a proven track record of building successful partnerships with business, government, and community leaders. Mr. Caron's public sector experience includes almost 10 years as deputy minister to several departments such as environment and local government, agriculture, aquaculture and fisheries, and economic development. Mr. Caron is also a member of the MB Business Council and a director on the board of the Association of Canadian Port Authorities. Just before we get started, a few housekeeping items. So please ensure for the duration of the presentation, if you're viewing, that your video and microphone are off. And also we'll be recording this to YouTube, so you can view at a later time or share with others. Also, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat window and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. And finally, we would like to give a huge thank you to our sponsors, Port St. John and Commercial Properties Limited. So their support is crucial to the work that we do here. Yes, and so I'll leave it to you, Denis, if you want to get started.
Well, thank you very much, Megan, and good afternoon, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well today. So Jessica is going to help me here essentially with the presentation. So we do have probably 15 slides or so that we've put together for you today, and hopefully run through it. And if you have any questions or comments, we certainly would be open to hear from you. So Jessica, maybe we'll start on the next slide. So maybe just some background with respect to the Port of Belledune. So we are part of the Canadian Port Authorities, which also includes Port St. John, Halifax, Montreal, Vancouver, and others. So we're part of that larger family. The port was built back in 1968, and it was really to support the mining sector here in northern New Brunswick, in particular, also the forestry sector. So Brunswick Mine operated here until 2014. It was actually the largest ore body in the world. It ran almost 50 years. And because of the mining operation, a lead smelter was actually put here at the port. And that's the reason that the port was built, was really to ship out the iron ore and the processed materials from the smelter. So we're primarily in dry bulk, liquid bulk, and break bulk. So unlike perhaps other ports, we don't have a container service here, nor do we have cruise ships, but we're really into bulk materials. We have close to 6,500 acres, probably closer to 10,000 acres, quite frankly, in our region for development. And of course, unlike ports like St. John or Halifax or Montreal, we're not located in an urban area. So we essentially are more rural in nature. Despite the cold weather here in northern New Brunswick, we are open year-round. We are open 24/7. And we've been, rather busy despite, the pandemic in the last few years. And essentially for us, our objective is really to provide, stability to our tenants, stability to the users of the port, and make sure that any investments that are made, either from them or from us, are done in a secure way. Next slide, please. So this gives you a bit of a visual of the port. So again, you can see the land that we have. So we have essentially 4 terminals, terminal 1, 2, 3, 4. You see some of the product that we have this is on terminal number 3. And although you don't see the lead smelter, which would be on the left side of the photo, you certainly see the power plant in the backdrop, which is the New Brunswick Power Plant. that operates a 480 megawatt plant and uses about 800 to 1 million tons of coal per year. So that gives you kind of a layout of the port itself. Next slide, please. So if we look at it from another angle, so essentially the lands that we own are in dark blue, so roughly 1,600 acres that are there. And on the left side is the New Brunswick Power land. There's 3,000 acres. And on the right side, there's another 3,000 acres, which was where the smelter was and other lands that Glencore owned and used. Just on this, maybe a few highlights with respect to NB Power and Glencore. So the power plant was built about 27 years ago. As I mentioned, it produces about 500 megawatts on the system. NB Power's system is about 4,000 megawatts, so it's pretty important to the network. The footprint is large in due because at the time there were plans to build actually 4 power plants here in Belledune, and only one was built. So at the time they did reserve the land and they were looking to build essentially 4 power plants, and a lot of the infrastructure to support those 4 power plants was built, but ultimately not used. So there is extra capacity that we have here at the port with respect to the operations. On the other side, of course, the lead smelter operated until 2019. It closed its operation back then. At the time, there was roughly 450 people working directly at the smelter and probably another 500 or 600 people working indirectly. This probably will be the largest cleanups in New Brunswick's history. So we want to make sure that it's done correctly. And as such, we've hired some extra staff and legal experts to help us to ensure that the permitting and the cleanup would be done correctly. Next slide, please. One of the key partners that we have here at the port, and we're very proud of, is First Nations. So we're actually the only port in Canada that has a formal relationship with First Nations. We have had that now since May of 2018. So with the Mi'kmaq community here on the east coast of New Brunswick, we have agreements with the 8 Mi'kmaq communities, although we work closer with the communities of Papineau and Eel River Bar. And because we are in northern New Brunswick and we share the Bay of Shore with the Gaspé Peninsula or with Quebec, we also have 3 Mi'kmaq communities on the Quebec or Gaspé side of the bay that we're actually in conversations with about signing a similar agreement. So very proud of that agreement, and it really allows us to work in partnership, to plan for the future together, to look at different projects together, and to make sure that the community is very involved in our future. Next slide, please. So essentially, when we talk about sustainability and we're looking at reducing a CO2 footprint and reducing emissions, the Government of Canada back in 2018 put it into place a national task force to tour the country and to look essentially at how we could reduce CO2 overall, and in particular with coal. So there are 4 provinces that still burn coal in Canada: Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. And here in New Brunswick, it's really Belledune that burns coal in its plant. The province of New Brunswick has done a very good job, in my opinion, in really reducing the carbon footprint. 82% of electricity that is produced here in New Brunswick is produced with no emissions per se. So when you think of hydro with Mactaquac, when you think with nuclear at Point Lepreau, when you think of renewable projects that we have around the province, essentially that would represent about 82% of non-emitting. And the other 18% is always the toughest. I would say Belledune here is about 12% of that. So clearly Belledune is on people's radar to reduce emissions by 2030. But at the same time, It's a very important asset to NB Power, and they are looking at other ways or other fuels to use that could replace coal and allow the coal-fired or allow the power plant to continue to operate beyond 2030. Next slide, please. So in the process of the federal regulation to cease the use of coal, we were successful in getting about $1.5 million from the federal government through Alcoa from the Coal Transition Fund to really put into play a long-term plan for the port, but for the region as well. And of course, what we have been looking at is really doing it in a very sustainable way. So looking at what are some of the benefits around regional economic development, looking at, of course, industrial growth, because that's an area that we know well, but how can we do it in a clean and sustainable way? Looking at technology and innovation. So we want to be leading edge, want to be part of the future. So what technologies are out there today? What can we use and how can we innovate? And of course, we want to be environmentally responsible. So doing whatever we can in a very sustainable way. So once again, how can we look at combining those three elements into any plan that we're doing? Next slide, please. So part of the process, there are 4 questions that essentially we started with is, what do we have here to offer? You know, what are some of the assets, or what are some of the elements that we have? What is it that we want? You know, what is it that we want for the future? And once again, I think it's important to note that we do want clean industries. We also want clean projects. So how can we advance on that? How do we get there? And quite frankly, who cares? So So who cares? Of course, when we have the communities, we have First Nations, we have industries, we have a multitude of groups and organizations that really do care. So once again, have to take into consideration their thoughts and their comments as well. Next slide, please. So where we started in the plan, like any good plan, you have to look at doing an analysis. So we looked at from a port's point of view, look at the market opportunities, look at essentially how could we develop other markets. Our primary market is Europe. We handle 27 different types of products, whether they're dry or liquid bulk. So once again, you know, are there other opportunities for that? Looked at as well, you know, commercial and industrial real estate, because as a port, we do have quite a bit of buildings, we have land, we have other amenities that are very important. Do we have enough? Do we have to build? What else do we have to do? So we really looked at it from that perspective as well. And then, of course, looked at regional opportunities and broke that down into 2 segments. What one is called gateway number 1, which is really different products that we could really get into and more commodity type products. And gateway number 2 is really using, you know, green energy or green fuels to really attract that industry and to give us kind of an edge with respect to other jurisdictions globally in what they're doing. So the work that was done in the last year was really to look at, you know, the market and look at the opportunities going forward. Next slide. So the 4 products that really looked into was bioproducts. So of course, there is a huge demand with respect to these types of products. We of course have quite a bit of land. We have energy sources that we could use to produce different bioproducts as well. So how can we enhance, you know, what we're doing either here in the province or in Canada? Agriculture and aquaculture, of course, we're next to the Acadian Peninsula, so the fishery is a very big sector here. But as we know in New Brunswick, there's opportunities to really enhance our aquaculture, on-land aquaculture in particular. And of course, agriculture, looking at more food products that can be developed here in our region and quite frankly at the port, and using the port, for export purposes of these products. Clean packaging is an area that is growing, despite the fact that we are still using quite a bit of packaging. There are new packages on the market that are more sustainable and much more environmentally friendly. So that's an area that we believe we can get into in greater detail. And then finally, construction materials. Here we're talking about primarily products like cement or green cement or steel or green steel, more of the industrial type products that can be developed using essentially greener material. So once again, these are the four sectors, if you will, that we'll be developing over the course of time. Next slide, please. However, to really, get into broader opportunities, if we're able to use renewable energy as the energy source for these plants or these industrial operations, or if we're able to use cleaner fuel instead of using coal or petcoke, if we can use hydrogen, if we can use storage within renewables, how do we incorporate kind of the environmental aspects to the business side of things, and how can we use that as kind of a lever to attract not only investment but really to grow markets around the world. And we all know that the consumers are going in this direction. They're looking for greener products, and essentially to produce greener products, you need greener energies in the process. So that's a key ingredient, if you will, that we've been working on once again for the past 1.5 to 2 years. Next slide, please. So as I said, the world is changing. There are different strategies that the governments are putting into place. Here in Canada, the government of Canada is very aggressive with its green energy strategy, in particular with green hydrogen. So that strategy has been in place now since 2020. The feds are also looking at creating what's called regional hydrogen hubs. I mean, Belledune could be one of those hubs, not only for domestic use, but also for export purposes. We are part of a national board on hydrogen with Natural Resources Canada, so we've been very involved in that as well. As I mentioned, there are other strategies, such as the Clean Growth Hub that was created back in 2018 that we're also part of, a series of conferences and events that are occurring yearly on a recurring basis, target setting with respect to emissions and reducing emissions, and looking obviously at what's being done elsewhere. So looking at what's being done in Europe in particular, and some of the unfortunate repercussions of what's going on in Russia and the Ukraine, that on one hand is extremely sad, but does create opportunities for Canada to supply and support Ukraine in particular. And Canada as a nation has agreements with other nations such as Germany and such as the Netherlands, and specifically around clean energy and clean tech. So how can we take advantage of some of those strategies that are currently in place and use them in our development? Next slide, please. So this is really where we get into kind of what we're coining the Green Energy Hub, and I'll get into a bit more detail on that. Next slide. So again, how can we, whether we're here in Belledune or in St. John or anywhere else in New Brunswick or Canada, how can we be a catalyst for the transition? We certainly are leaders here in the community. We have a certain responsibility and a certain role to play. Well, how can we essentially be and play a leadership role in that space? How can we focus on attracting environmentally sustainable projects or companies to our location, which is very important, because Globally speaking, there is growing demand with respect to these types of companies, but how can we attract them here in our own province? How can we support global demand for renewable and non-emitting energy? We're seeing that the grid, whether it's here in New Brunswick or other utilities, are looking for more renewables because the demand is growing. Renewables are becoming cheaper to produce, which is great because 15 or 20 years ago, wind energy was much more expensive than it is today. So how can we take advantage of that and incorporate it in any strategy or plans that we have? How can we as a port really look at using our land base? I mentioned to you that between the port, the Glencore property and NB Power's property, we have close to 10,000 acres of land sitting on the Atlantic Ocean. How can we use that land for proper development and doing it in a very sustainable way? How can we support clearly, local industry here in our region and beyond? So incorporating some of that into this plan is what we've been focused on. And also, how can we look at some of the newer technologies that are coming out? We have in New Brunswick 2 small modular reactor groups that are looking to perfect their technologies. How can we incorporate that in what we do? New Brunswick is one of the only jurisdictions in Canada that has nuclear, but the government of Canada does support nuclear development. So how can we take that strength that we have and develop it for either use here in New Brunswick or beyond? How can we expand wind and solar development? So, just recently in St. John, we saw essentially an expansion project there. We have a number of projects that we're working on here that also include wind and solar, but how can we essentially incorporate that in what we're doing? Hydrogen production is the fuel of the future. Yes, it may be a few years away, but technology is in place today to make that happen. So once again, do we want to be part of a leading edge process or do we want to follow the pack? So I believe that there is an opportunity for us to be very much involved in leading this process. Microgrids are important to the system. So sometimes we have to look at the system we currently have in place and can we bring on more energy sources? And of course, when we talk about storage, whether it be through hydrogen or storage, if it's through batteries, how, once again, can we include that in our plan going forward? Next slide, please. So just our history here in Northern New Brunswick. So, of course, I mentioned the lead smelter, a power plant, and other chemical plants, pulp and paper industries that we had here that are no longer in place. But in Northern New Brunswick, here at the port, we had 2 of the top 5 largest emitters. So the second largest emitter behind the refinery in St. John is NB Power's plant, coal-fired plant here in Belledune. And the third, essentially up until 2019, was the lead smelter that closed. So there is an opportunity now that those industries are either have left or are reducing their use of, in the case coal, to really transition to cleaner. And of course, some of those industries that we did have here, unfortunately, did not reinvest in technology or look at better ways of producing their products. And as a result of a downturn in the economy, simply closed their operations and left the region and left the province. So how can we look at industries that will stay around for multiple generations and employ New Brunswickers and people that reside here in the region, but also create economic wealth for our province? So that's currently the past. And if we look at the next slide, we're really talking about the future. And once again, it's to empower our communities to take the climate action through the Green Energy Hub, to really looking at ways of driving down carbon in our area, looking at using cleaner fuels or cleaner energy to produce different industrial products that, as we mentioned before, that can be done, and really to focus our attentions on development and the adoption, I should say, of clean technology. So once again, using those principles, how can we incorporate that in any economic strategy or plan going forward? Next slide. So this is really the nub or the crux of our strategy, and I'll just take a few minutes just to go through it very carefully with everybody. So biomass is a form of energy that essentially is greener. Ironically, we are the largest exporter of wood pellets on the East Coast. We export anywhere between 400,000 to 500,000 metric tons of biomass, which would be pellets in particular, over to Europe that they feed in their power plants to reduce CO2. The same power plants, by the way, that we have here next door to us. So once again, we could easily feed more biomass into the power plant, replace the coal that's being used, and hence reduce CO2. As I mentioned to you, SMR, small modular reactors, new technology that's being developed, and that technology will be able, hopefully, to be used in the next 7, 8, 10 years from now, and could be used here in Belledune, could be certainly used in other areas of New Brunswick. But these units can also be exported to different countries around the world and used essentially to reduce the CO2 footprint from there. Solar and wind, I think we know essentially quite a bit about those two areas. But one of the challenges still today around solar and wind is really how do you keep that energy stored when you're not using it? So, green batteries is a technology that we're actually working with a number of companies on to see if that technology can work and how it can be commercialized going forward. And then the big talk of late has been around hydrogen. So if we're using renewable energy to produce, especially green hydrogen, that will fuel the industries of tomorrow, how do we kind of look at producing or planning for that today? So hydrogen is a very important fuel that, as I say, is growing in popularity. Just in the last couple of months, I've been to 2 hydrogen conferences, one in Edmonton, Alberta, and the other one in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And I can tell you that there is a global appetite with respect to green hydrogen. But now if you have that hydrogen, you're able to produce it, and that's what we're suggesting, that we can produce green hydrogen here in New Brunswick and here in Belledune. Then if you can look at other product lines using hydrogen as a base. So you can mix hydrogen with carbon that you capture, so carbon capture to produce a greener fuel, so a clean fuel. And we already know that industry is going in that direction, whether it's for the maritime sector or whether it's for aircrafts or just transportation. We know that the transportation sector is one of the largest emitters in the world. And if we're able to use batteries as one opportunity, but if we're able to use and develop cleaner fuels, will be the other. So hydrogen will have a role to play there. If we are talking about, industrial products such as steel or cement or any other large industrial operation, once again, most of the fuel that's used for those heavy industries is either petcoke or coal, which emits a lot of CO2. But by using green hydrogen, we're able to reduce and eliminate that CO2 and produce a greener product that will be in demand going into the future. And if again you're able to produce green steel through hydrogen, the gases that are produced are considered green and can be recycled and fed back into the power plant, because one of the goals here clearly is to keep that power plant operating next door, but obviously using cleaner fuel in the process. So for each of these bubbles, if you will, that we have here, we've been extremely busy in the last year and a half, not only putting the strategy together, but literally talking to a number of players in all of this space. So as an example, with SMRs, we have an MOU with Moltex, we have an MOU with ARC that we've signed. I can tell you that we're talking to 3 or 4 hydrogen producers, global producers that are very interested in this. We're talking about essentially green batteries that could be used as well. So we are looking at cleaner ways of producing energy and fuel. Next slide, please. And again, one way of doing that is to ensure that we have the right infrastructure in place. So the grid itself here in New Brunswick, are we able to have more energy on the grid itself? So that requires some studies and work. So we've been working very closely with NB Power on that. We've been talking to, as I say, different investors, global investors that would be interested in really investing here in new technologies that would help essentially develop the grid, and looking at other ways as well, as I say, to support domestic industries here in Canada, whether they're refineries or power plants or other heavy industries that could use not only electric or green power, but cleaner fuels as well. Next slide, please. And finally, what we're trying to accomplish here is looking at reducing the emissions clearly in our region, but also in our province, in our country, finding ways to build a strong and resilient economy using, clean fuel and power to do that. And we believe that now is the time to start planning and really engaging and deploying these types of strategies. We have to do this in partnership. So whether it's with utilities, whether it's with the province or the government of Canada or industry, we do have a role to play, but we have to bring partners around the table essentially to achieve any objectives or goals that we set. Our efforts in reducing climate emissions, looking at really being proactive in setting up an action plan with respect to how we're going to develop and deploy such a strategy. And I think in Canada, we're starting to see that there's a lot more technology. I mean, one of the projects that we're working on carbon capture is technology from Canada that actually has been developed in British Columbia. So what other technologies do we have here in Canada that we can incorporate in this? And of course, if we're able to bring all of these pieces together, that becomes a hub that we essentially are working towards. And how can we use those energy sources to produce cleaner fuels such as hydrogen and clearly become a hydrogen hub here in not only in northern New Brunswick, but in eastern Canada. So that's our presentation. Wondering if there's any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Denis. Yep, we have a few questions. So first question from Keith Miller. So could we hear more about the possibility of converting Belledune to biomass? The biomass electrical generation is large in the UK at a number of sites, and they have port facilities for the transport of biomass. And I think you did speak to this a little more after he wrote this question, but did you have any further comments on that?
Well, there is an opportunity for Belledune. Like I mentioned, we export about 400,000 to 500,000 metric tons to Europe, to the UK in particular, and other jurisdictions. And we have to do it in a sustainable way. I mean, we're not simply going to go out and cut the forest down. We have currently 4 suppliers. We have 3 from New Brunswick, which are Groupe Savoie, JDI, and the Shaw Group. And because we border on Quebec, we have a 4th producer that uses the port here. If we were going to convert the power plant next door just to wood pellets or using wood pellets, you're talking about 1 million tons, and you would have to import as well biomass to produce that amount of wood pellets just to support the power plant next door. Wow. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done with respect to that, but But I think what we're advocating is that it has to be done in a sustainable way. We're not suggesting that we do this at all costs. I think there's a balance here in how we produce wood pellets and how we do add value added to the process.
Mhm. Perfect, thank you. And then another question from Keith, biomass coupled with carbon capture could have a negative CO2 impact, not carbon neutral, but removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Is this a realistic strategy?
Well, if you look at I know when you're talking more around the hydrogen side, there's a lot of debate around green hydrogen or blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is a combination of using natural gas and actually carbon storage or carbon capture. So it's almost similar with respect to that conversation. Is it neutral or not? Does it reduce it enough? I think there is probably some more work and understanding that needs to be there. But I think the point of what we're making here is really if you're able to capture the carbon. I know out west what they're able to do is they can bury the carbon. We don't have the geology here on the East Coast, so are there other opportunities to use it as a mix with hydrogen to make cleaner fuel? So I think there's still quite a bit of work that needs to be done on that. I know the government of Canada does consider biomass as a clean fuel, but with the carbon itself, how do we ensure that we get close to carbon neutral as possible?
Great, thank you. And then we have one final question. So this is from Fons Eisner. So her question is, with the Atlantic Loop being proposed, will the Port's Clean Energy Hub be a key enabler to this? And are you already in discussions or supporting this initiative?
We're actually supporting the initiative. I think we're understanding more and more about the Atlantic Loop as we become more involved in it. I think it's safe to say that the Atlantic Loop will not necessarily solve our needs here in Atlantic Canada. I mean, there still will be requirement to look at again, more renewables, to look at producing hydrogen for our industries, to really energize, if you will, our industries. So the Atlantic Loop clearly will allow, energy from Quebec and from Newfoundland to flow into the rest of Atlantic Canada and beyond. But with the electrification, as we know it, and which will increase, and I think NB Power themselves are saying could double or triple, there certainly will be more demand than the Atlantic Loop can really supply. So we think that renewables is still a very important piece of the puzzle here. And of course, the clean fuel like hydrogen will be extremely important as well.
Excellent. Well, I think those are all of our questions for today. So yeah, I think we'll wrap it up. So thanks very much, Denis. It was really interesting and just and so exciting to see what's happening in the northern part of the province. I mean, I think sometimes there is a bit of a disconnect between what's going on in the south and the north. So so just really exciting things happening for the Port of Belledune. And yeah, we look forward to hearing about your progress. So love to have you on again.
Well, thanks for the invitation, and again, happy to share. And anytime we have updates, we will provide them as well. So thank you again.
Excellent. Yeah. So thanks for taking the time, and thank you to everybody who's joined us. If you want to get involved, to have comments or questions, please reach out to us at info@sustainablestjohn.ca. And also just another thank you to our sponsors, Port St. John and Commercial Properties, for their support. And thank you, Denis.
Thank you very much. Have a nice
Okay.
day. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye.